Each morning, 8 billion people are rising to start their day. Each day, we slowly get a little closer to the promised collapse of the biosphere. Each of us is aware that the world is changing. Each summer, a little longer, a little hotter. In the background of business as usual, there is drastic and fast approaching change to the world that we live in. Everyone knows it. Climate change is on the news. It is admitted by everyone except for absolute conspiracy nuts and privately paid advertisement campaigns. Climate change is already embedded into our culture and imprinted into our collective psyche. Yet we act as if none of this was real. In the world that desperately needs action, inaction is our strategy of choice. We resort to indifference, denialism, or doomerism to justify our paralysis. Those who rebel the apathy of the world are punished by institutions and despised by the rest of society. Our governments and our institutions discuss war, technology, GDP, and immigration policies as if climate change was not real. And simple folk too live as if climate change was not happening. In the end, who of us will be responsible for the end of civilization and collapse of the biosphere? Will it be the 1%? These guys wield overwhelming amount of power, yet they funnel millions into building luxury bunkers. And I don't expect anyone who is confident in the world's prosperity to buy a luxury underground bunker. Will our institutions be to blame for the climate crisis? These bureaucratic machines of power that we build to keep brown people away from whatever white people call civilization. Will it ultimately be a responsibility of our government to fight climate change? If so, perhaps they should be less preoccupied with starting a third world war. Or will it ultimately be us to blame, regular folk? All of us in silent agreement with the systems that bring us closer and closer to climate collapse. Welcome, I'm Anna, and in this video we will talk about climate and apathy. I will discuss apathy and inaction, and I will take you deep into the pit of climate despair in search of a solution to climate apathy, so that by the end of this video you can turn from doomer into bloomer. Climate change is an expression of indifference that we are experiencing towards climate change. There are three explanations for our collective apathy. So in the spirit of capitalist free market, you can choose your own adventure. First explanation is evolutionary, biological. Some argue that our ape brain simply can't process the idea of collapse. Thus, we can just filter out the climate crisis as a background noise. And our ape brain indeed is quite primitive when it comes to anything in regards to climate change. For example, we emit about 40 metric tons of CO2 waste every year into the atmosphere. None of us can comprehend exactly how much that is. In our brain, 40 tons of CO2 is perceived as something bigger than an elephant, plus CO2 is colorless and odorless gas, so we got a planet with 8 billion advanced apes who don't have a brain capacity to comprehend how much waste we are generating. Under biological justification, apathy is simply a result of our brain's normal function. We can't comprehend climate crisis, so we don't care. Next one is a psychoanalytical explanation for apathy. Apathy and denial help us deal with things we don't like. We don't have to worry about climate change if it's not real. Easy as that. You think your conspiracy uncle is stupid? Well, actually, they may be smarter than you are, just in all the wrong ways. A simple belief that climate change is not real makes life way easier and far simpler. And deniers don't feel bad if they don't wash their mayonnaise jars before throwing them out. Psychology says that faced with the idea of collapse, our self-preservation mechanisms give us two options: deny the reality of climate change or try to redirect it onto somebody else, like scientists or China. Psychology throws a disaster fatigue and caretaker fatigue into the mix, ultimately concluding that worrying about climate change is a first world problem. People at large can't afford to experience climate anxiety because they are already living on the verge of collapse. The third explanation of climate apathy is that of a free market. Note, don't forget to invest into water futures if you wish to retire. One of the main gods of a man, the invisible hand of a free market, will just figure climate crisis out. This is apathy driven by your governor's most favorite climate arguments. Capitalism seems to expect that once we extract all oil, the price of oil will go up, making billion-dollar profits for corporations and executives. But then, the invisible hand of a free market will quickly turn big oil into one big-ass wind fan. According to a free market view on climate change initiatives, we are already on track for success and nothing needs to be done. According to the neoliberal approach to climate change, any climate action is viewed as unwanted or in interference with the fate that is wielded by their favorite invisible hand. I swear, neoliberal economists are just the epicenter of modern esotericism. Independent of explanation that we choose for climate apathy, there is also a survival bias. Like kids that imagine themselves as medieval knights and ladies instead of choleric peasants, we imagine that climate collapse will not affect us, but instead it will affect someone else. Westerners think that climate change will affect those brown people down south and will not affect global north. I personally have a strong survival bias that is justified in my brain by the idea that I know how to garden and have basic knowledge of foraging and homesteading. Arguably, too much survival bias for somebody who lives in a place that turns into a dry freezer for 3 months out of the year. Western culture views climate change as a dangerous infected wound, an inevitable disaster. In return, the final climate collapse feels almost like chemotherapy or an amputation, a painful but necessary procedure that can cleanse the world. Maria Bright and Chris Ames write in their work on climate apathy and climate activism in youth. Youth are not alone in the apathy or denial stage of the journey. For decades, governmental, corporate, and individual denial and reluctance to take action, combined with the need to protect status quo, have shaped fundamental behaviors and attitudes towards climate crisis mitigation. The apathy of youth, however, as suggested by strike leaders' comments, may arise not from disengagement, but as a protection strategy. Collapse is marketed to younger people as both an inevitable future and their only chance to build a different world. Hypnotized by the promise of quick solution to our misery, we tag along to the end in a hope of salvation. We are coping with the climate crisis as if apathy was the only possible solution. But why? Are there seriously no better options? Of course, there is an alternative to apathy: climate anxiety and doomerism. Doomerism comes in all shapes and sizes across the political spectrum. Common narrative in the leftist doomer spaces is that we are small people. By nature of limited power and capitalist subversion, working class can't be responsible for climate change or its consequences. I myself tend to agree with this argument. Top 10% and especially top 1% emit a lot more than regular working-class American and a lot more than working-class people outside of the imperial core. Governments, corporations, wealth owners, those who own power and wealth, are consuming and polluting more than regular people, as well as disproportionately benefit from the climate crisis, and thus they should carry responsibility for the end of the world. In a retaliation to the rise of this very dangerous leftist narrative, we get the idea of green capitalism, where we get promised that corporations and executives are becoming just so invested in climate action. Unfortunately, the higher the person is on the power ladder, the less facts they give about climate collapse. The most green capitalism can provide is fake promises made by politicians during the next scheduled environmental conference sponsored by Coca-Cola and ExxonMobil. All the negative attributes that you can attach to climate change can and will get worse with time as countries and corporations fail to produce any meaningful change. The world of top businessmen is indifferent to the struggle of working folk and is absolutely indifferent to the struggle of animals or environment. And when apathy is championed by most wealthy and powerful of the world, do we have any other option but to stare into the dark approaching abyss with our own paralyzed indifference? Through marketing, media, and political affairs, we are taught from a young age that world runs as it does, and all struggle against the machine is useless and dangerous. We are told that rebellion only feeds chaos and never produces an effective result. This teaching is most evident in media reports of climate activism. Some activist actions are presented as dangerous, some as courageous. But all of climate activism is presented to us as beyond all useless. But if climate activism is useless, then why is it punished so harshly? As I started working on this video, Just Stop Oil activists in UK got handled the maximum possible sentence for their activism and failed their court appeal. While we can certainly argue about the ethics of paralyzing traffic in the middle of Metropolitan, none of the actions of the activists were violent. Yet, court judge specifically noted that tight sentencing terms are served to repel others from following the activists' footsteps in the future. On one side, news media presents activism as useless. On the other side, governmental persecution makes it clear that climate activism is disruptive, dangerous, and will not be tolerated. Government leaders private jet to the conferences where they talk about climate actions that none of them are going to comply with anyway. But back home, they throw all possible forms of state-sanctioned violence over environmental activism of any kind. And it is not that the world leaders don't care about the environment. The situation is actually much worse. Governments, like businesses, are powerful organizations that benefit from climate change. Governmental officials are interested in the opposite of climate action. They are interested in making sure that no climate action happens before all possible profits are extracted from fossil fuels. When the time comes, the profit channels can be redirected to minerals and metals of not-so-green energy. But for now, the message that governments send us is clear. Any action against fossil fuel businesses will be punished. If you dare to realize your climate anxiety in any active way, you will be punished. So even if climate anxiety is what we feel, climate apathy is the only thing that we are allowed to express safely. When it comes to political sphere, effects of climate change are quite strange. Rarely do we see direct effects of CO2 emissions. Instead, there is an increase in immigration into imperial core, bleaching of coral reefs, and critical sriracha shortage. None of the contemporary issues can be intuitively linked directly to CO2 emissions. For a lot of people, the connection between the biosphere and economics, as well as environment and themselves, was never established on a personal or educational level, which contributes to climate denialism and climate apathy. And I know it is a little early for the story time that early into the video, but anyway, let me tell you a story of how I learned about Biosphere. When I was in school, an environmental education was not in a program in any form, despite the fact that I was going through a science-heavy route. And behold, in grade 10, my school needed to send a couple of students for a regional school conference in astronomy. So what does one do as an odd biology student at an astronomy conference? Obviously, I picked to present in the category that was as far away as possible from physics. So there I rolled into an astronomy conference with my report on philosophy of Cosmism. Cosmism is an odd little corner of philosophical studies that was developed in USSR and US in early ages of space exploration. Cosmism philosophers viewed space as a whole as one ecosystem, noosphere, that combines spiritual and material aspects. They viewed each planet as its own isolated cell, almost like a living cell in a giant body of universe. In their thinking about space travel, early space scientists heavily relied on the concept of biosphere as a system that makes it possible to live in a space rock for an extended period of time. So yes, I rolled into physics presentation section with a report on how Earth is one ginormous living spaceship and we all are just part of a noosphere that connects everything in space and time. For those interested, I did get a first prize in my category marked Cosmism because among 150 students, I was the only one presenting in this category. So after that, I just assumed that most of my peers, most of my audience, and most of the people on the planet were denied any formal introduction to concept of environmental science in general. It is not surprising that a lot of the older folk deny climate change. Interconnected everything crisis is not something that they know or can comprehend. Retirement homes that we call parliaments are full of people who view world as a collection of compartmentalized and isolated boxes that do not have anything in common. In their world, economy exists completely independent of sociology or science, and this is how they shape our reality through their actions too. Politicians and business executives ignore the fact that our economies stem from the earth, from resources that we extract and things that we enjoy to our actual biological bodies that we use for work to produce economic wealth. And if people with overwhelming amount of power can't understand the link between humans and planet, how can we expect them to build a decent society that is in harmony with itself, yet alone in harmony with the environment? Speaking of understanding, what is climate change? If you go on Wikipedia, it will tell you that climate change is defined as the ongoing increase in global average temperature and its effects on Earth's atmosphere and climate. But is that it? If climate change is just a change in temperature due to atmospheric pollution, then solution is simple. Put batteries into everything from smart toilets to smart pillows and replace oil with wind and solar and just live happily ever after. But if we decide to simply redirect overconsumption instead of building anything sustainable, we will just start depleting different resources and cause a different form of pollution. Climate change is not our problem. Instead, climate change is an indicator, one of many symptoms of a problem, which is far, far worse. Overshoot. For those unanointed by doom, overshoot is a form of relationship between humans and biosphere, in which humans consume planetary resources faster than biosphere is able to regenerate or compensate for consumption. So since I already got you here, let's do something absolutely ungodly by the standards of YouTube entertainment. Let's draw a graph. So, this is an exponential graph. It can describe many things related to consumption, but in this case, this is humanity's head count, or our fossil consumption. A long time ago, biologists and anthropologists voiced their concerns that this graph looks hell of a lot like the first half of what is known as a population boom and bust cycle. If resources are abundant, like modern fossil fuels, the population of species will grow. And then, when resources are depleted or otherwise limited, population will plummet down like a chicken egg, with equally smashing results.
The one undeniably erodible and irreversibly erodible part of the model is the non-renewable resource sector. This is oil and metals and all of those things which we take out of the ground and do not or cannot recycle. And to the extent that all of this industrial activity is dependent on that sort of resource, this is a constantly eroding level. It only has an outflow rate. It doesn't have an inflow rate. That is, the rate at which oil is generated is so slow that we haven't even bothered to include it in the model. And this, therefore, is a major aspect of the model with regard to the permanence of the carrying capacity of the system. And in fact, it says as long as we're reliant on those resources, it's not a very permanent system.
Sometime in the 90s, a gentleman named William Rees took a far more complicated version of this graph and produced a work called Ecological Footprints and Appropriated Carrying Capacity, What Urban Economics Leaves Out. Not very catchy, I know. But in his work, Rees combined environmental science, anthropology, and economy, and a lot of people did not like the result. Rees concluded that modern societies, especially cities, rely on extracting and overconsuming resources from external sources, and that our unlimited ability to extract resources will inevitably lead to overshoot. And so far, time is proving him right. His work turned him into one of the most notorious climate doomers and perhaps one of the most pessimistic climate scientists that you can find today. I do not agree with Rees' conclusions, because I believe that his shade of doomerism is the most dysfunctional viewpoint that you can take. In his interviews, Rees often claims any climate initiatives as useless, no matter how successful they are. His doomerism is basically an old guy screaming at the cloud, but in his case, he's screaming at the cloud about climate collapse. Independent of his conclusions, I also think that Rees is one of the most fascinating environmental scientists, and he produced tremendous amount of work within climate and crisis research. Rees was one of the first to point out how isolation between fields of study in Western academia negatively affects our education and our politics and technology. If you go to university to study chemistry or physics or biology, all subjects will be divided into their own little associated chambers and classes. If for some reason you end up studying combinatory subjects like, say, biochemistry, your natural reaction is to scream and cry.
Okay.
So now we have the delta ALA.
Yay, niche science jokes. Economy is the worst offender when it comes to academic isolation. Isolation of the economy from the rest of the world follows our policies, our science, our education, and other aspects of life. We are like little capitalist aliens that try to suck Earth dry for profit and return back to our spaceship. Except there is no spaceship to return to. And the thing is, it is not really capitalism or neoliberalism that creates climate change, though capitalism does play a significant role in why and how we pollute. Our detachment from the biosphere goes way beyond our markets. Our education, our religion, our governance, and other institutions all play a symphony of a coming collapse. We live as if the biosphere is both dispensable and secondary to our life. We isolate the environment from our institutions, and we deny even a slight idea that we are, after all, animals that need a livable environment, water, food, and air. As a result, we destroy the planet that supports our biological existence for the sake of what? Money? Progress? Comfort? Is there really progress or comfort in the world where more fortunate of us rush from birth to death in one soulless shopping spree, while those less fortunate can't even afford food or shelter, while 3 richest men are having a space race? Instead of reconciling our relationship with the planet or rethinking our social systems, we are proposed a collection of ideas that promise us that we do not need to change anything or question status quo to avoid climate collapse. Range of solutions is never-ending. Green capitalism, extraterrestrial exploration, carbon capture, terraforming, spraying aerosols across the atmosphere to reflect sunlight back into space, mass planting trees, mass planting algae, spraying Arctic ice with glass, building protective walls around glaciers, injecting oceans with iron, putting a belt of reflective satellites around the orbit, or, even better, let's just accept that extinction is our new normal. Aside from an obvious problem that many proposed solutions rely on technology that doesn't exist, there is a less obvious problem. Even though some of the solutions may reduce carbon emissions and address climate change to some extent, none of them address the underlying problem of overshoot and overconsumption. The promise of green capitalism or reforestation initiatives does not challenge the narrative that brought us to climate change in the first place. We are still promised more money, more energy, more stuff, more consumption. Rees writes in his work on human nature and denialism, "We do not have a built-in off switch that is tripped by sufficiency. We habituate to any level of consumption. Once a given level is attained, satisfaction quickly diminishes. Our tendency to consume and accumulate ratchets up. This is particularly so if we perceive that another social group is getting ahead faster than we are. Even within wealthy societies, widening income gaps lead to personal frustration and declining population health. So efforts to keep up with the Kardashians continue unabated." Can we really blame Rees and other doomers for the position that they take when the main modern line of solutions to climate change relies on non-existent technology and doubles down on actions that created climate change in the first place? After all, Rees considers himself to be climate realist, not a doomer. Chances are you may already know the solution to climate change and even to overshoot, solution that is supported by scientists, even by doomer ones like Rees. Degrowth is the word that you can hear from climate activists and environmental scientists and fellow YouTubers. On the population dynamics, it looks something like that. It's when human consumption is going down under the controlled and humane conditions to return to the limits of planetary boundaries. Side note here. Some political figures and scientists, including Rees himself, advocate for population degrowth through population control. I prefer to use metrics like reduction in energy or resource consumption rather than relying on pure headcount, because pure headcount does not account for the disruptive pattern of consumption across the economic and social spectrum. Some disagree with this approach, but I have opinions, and one of these opinions is that any form of institutionalized population control is always going to be sexist, racist, ableist, and overall disgusting. You want to have more reasonable population counts? Cool! Then why won't we start by empowering family planning and returning body autonomy back to women, instead of simply policing our bodies once again? How about that? But back to the topic. Degrowth requires us to overcome the imagination crisis. It requires us to reimagine and rebuild the world. There is nothing threatening about degrowth. Things like healthcare, education, art, entertainment, personal fulfillment, and growth are all more possible and even more approachable under the degrowth economy. There is only one very big problem with degrowth, that it is not compatible with existing institutions and it is in direct opposition to capitalism. Given the situation we're in and the lack of any existing action to avert climate catastrophe, I too find apathy appealing, or at least understandable. I'm not sure how to process the fact that orangutans are more leopards or pangolins, which were doing fairly fine at the time I was born, can become completely extinct by the time I die. Do you know that baobab trees are on the list for extinction? I never saw a baobab tree in my life in person, yet I feel grief. Do I contribute to their death? Alternative to apathy is constant anxiety and deep, unforgiving grief. So can we blame anyone for numbing themselves if an alternative to indifference is constant distress that cannot be alleviated? In their opposition to medical classification of climate anxiety as disease, eco-psychology researcher Hogan Hickman suggests that climate anxiety should not be classified as a disease. They note that climate anxiety is not a pathological reaction. Instead, climate anxiety and climate grief are normal. They are expected reaction to knowledge about climate change. Bright and Eames further elaborate on Hickman's work. Anxiety should not be considered a deficit emotion, but one that shows awareness and could therefore be reframed as eco-empathy, as it is an emotional, congruent, and healthy response to an individual's growing understanding and cognitive awareness of the climate crisis. There is another level to how we process climate change and associated negative emotions and thoughts. We view climate change as a single event, a particular point in time in the future where our institutions and infrastructure collapse on itself under the weight of social unrest and environmental crisis. Climate collapse fits very well with our linear understanding of time, our mythology, and culture. The world has to end. It also doesn't help that most dominant religions in the world have a well-developed apocalyptic mythology. Apocalypse, collapse, or any other end-of-the-world scenario is a convenient lie that we tell ourselves that both justifies our inaction and redirects our problems and responsibilities to some faraway point in time. We would love to toss climate collapse to future generations to figure it all out. Like, here you go, Mr. 4-year-old, let's play a farmhouse, except your crops just died due to soil erosion and your farm is an uninhabitable hellscape. Unfortunately, climate collapse is not a thing of the future. We actually already live in it right now. Majority of the indigenous and tribal populations in modern world live under conditions where they already lost their lands. They lost their cultures and languages. Lands that were stripped from them by colonial expansion are now further eroded and appropriated by neo-colonial powers. Tell them that climate collapse is a problem of the future. Millions of workers in Global South have to work in unsafe working conditions, in heat and humidity that are considered to be dangerous to their health. Families and elderly in southern regions are exposed to critical levels of heat in their own homes and on the streets, shortening lifespans of those less fortunate, increasing the prevalence of infectious disease, and forcing thousands to face hostile shores of the global north. Tell them that climate collapse is a problem of the future. Over 50 million hectares of forest burned this year in Canada, taking away hundreds of homes, but also burning alive millions of living creatures, of animals and trees that we consider so unimportant that we don't even take them into account when we talk about climate change. Tell them that climate collapse is a problem of the future. We can have conferences and businessmen and politicians who go around and shake each other's hands. They talk how they plan to reach net zero by 3027 or contain climate change to an ever-growing number of degrees or turn Mars into tech bro hellscape. But in the world outside of cabinets and chairs full of rich old men, climate collapse just happened. Denialism of some and apathy of many serve one very important purpose. It helps us soften the reality of the world that resorts to inaction, greed, and war at the time of despair. Youth today faces an unprecedented crisis in mental health. In addition to more traditional threats such as nuclear war and capitalist stagnation, teenagers and children alive today will also have to face unknowable and rapid climate change. We don't know what is a healthy alternative to the endless anxiety and grief other than to train ourselves to be completely numb. Is there a way to therapy yourself out of the thought that orangutans and baobab trees are going extinct? How much apathy do I need to erase pictures of the shoreline homes about to be swallowed by the sea out of my brain? Or the footage of dead fish just slowly floating on the ocean surface together with the tides? Is there a way to not go insane in the world where, as a result of human activities, animals and trees are burning alive in the forest? In the end, doom seems like the only alternative to apathy. Doomerism is often presented to be the same thing as empathy, a dysfunctional grief for the end of the world. But what if the world that we know already ended, and doom is justified? What if doomerism is a cure for apathy? Climate crisis is not a singular event. It is a period of time and intertwined chains of decisions and events that take place in the past, today, and in the future. Maybe fate of humanity was sealed when we came up with capitalism, or discovered coal, or when our ancestors left African plains, eating their way through ecosystems as the most adaptable mammals to ever walk the earth. No one knows exactly where we turned wrong. But we do know that our understanding of climate crisis and catastrophes matters. And if climate change is not a single point in the future, but a series of events in the present, then actions that we take suddenly have a weight and a meaning. If we treat climate collapse as something that is already happening, then our actions and decisions as individuals, but especially as organized groups and communities, have far more achievable goals and targets. The goal is not to prevent climate change, because we already failed at that. Now, there is a million of other small goals to minimize climate crisis effects across any and all areas of life and all ecosystem. Young but gifted anthropologist Abby Hoover writes in her essay titled, "We're All Going to Die." The failure to link planetary crisis with systems of power like neoliberal globalization and the coloniality of power incapacitates collective imageries from sufficiently addressing the conditions of crisis. This is a function of protecting homogeneic power systems, which would be threatened by a collective of power that can imagine an alternative way of living without trillionaires, without police, and without oil. Pushing limits of the collective imagery in response to the planetary scale crisis and taking action outside of capitalist and governmental frameworks involves redistribution of sacrifice and power. It involves questioning status quo. But planetary crisis is already here, and it has been. It has been escalating, and it will likely continue to. I believe that there has to be a better way, or rather better ways, plural, and many ways within many different worlds. We might die, but why give up trying when we haven't yet exhausted the possibilities for meaningful, generative, and much more lively response? Grief, anxiety, and doom are unpleasant, but they are all emotions that can drive action. We're bound by history, by economic and political systems, by places we are born in and we live in, by our biological needs, and by social conditions that surround us. But so were all the people before us, and so will everybody who comes after us. When history is presented to us as a collection of massive events led and organized by singular, isolated, rich white dudes, it is easy to forget that all history, all parts of social change for the better, were forged by the hands of many. Social movements are not made in one day, nor are they created by single, isolated individuals. Instead, movements and change is created by hands and actions of thousands of people. I am a firm believer that in the face of indifference of for-profit economy and war-obsessed governments, grief and anxiety can lead to actions that will benefit future social movements and future people. Today, people around the world take small and big steps to contradict future collapse, often exactly because they feel climate anxiety and doom. Aside from direct action, there is also art, literature, storytelling, education, memes and jokes. In our art and creativity, there is drama, beauty, there is struggle and pain, but also there is hope. James Tierney writes in his poem, "They Came for the Shale." The sparrow your dad loves to watch pick seeds from the bottom of the garden is getting too hot to fly. It's pecking at its own feathers in some attempt at relief. Your bank holiday seems to disappear, while through the kitchen window, great machines bore holes deep into your countryside view. He brought you up on the line, nothing lasts forever. But you had that plastic giraffe on your windowsill for 23 years, and it is still as good as new. Thousands of people every day forge a new mythology, a new idea of the world in post-apocalypse, new ways of thinking about climate change. In their collective and individual work, they write a story where instead of waiting for the world to end in disaster, we build a better world out of the one that we already have. That's all I've got for you today. Subscribe so we see each other on the next one.